Hey, everybody. I'm Jen Gaboury. I'm the first vice president of the PSC CUNY. Welcome to CUNY, if you are not of CUNY. And it's a real pleasure to host this panel on LGBTQ in the union. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll each take 15 minutes to leave ample time, right, for conversation. It's a real pleasure to be back here with CLAGS. I served in the CLAGS board for several years, and it's exciting to be at this conference. And thank you, Matt and Yasmina, and everybody else who did work to make this conference possible. It's very exciting. All right, so I want to introduce Kayleigh Truman of ATSE Local 1. And if you don't know what ATSE is, right, it is a stagehand and theater union, and I am going to invite the panelists to say a little bit more about their work, right? And Fritz of Starbucks Workers United. Woo, yeah, okay. So, all right, so let's get started. Kayleigh, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about what it means for you in terms of being LGBTQ in the union, your experiences, the issues that have come up.
Sure. So a little bit on my background is I'm a carpenter, props artisan by trade. I've worked in entertainment, live theater and stuff like that, dance, music, for over 17 years. And I've been on and off Broadway for over 10. Due to my spine looking like that of a carpenter, I've had to transition to, I'm now a PhD student with Rutgers University. Yay, keeping healthcare. But I love it. Anyway, so as a stagehand, I had done everything from traditional Broadway, big musicals, small musicals, to Madison Square Garden. And when I started, my dad is also in the union, so I'm a second generation stagehand, which is really common. And he told me 3 things when I first started. 1, keep your head down and do the work. Fair enough. Misogyny is gonna happen, you gotta get used to it. And whatever you do, don't come out. And I only listened to the first of those 3 things. I very quickly learned that you had to make your place and you had to find your community. I absolutely lucked out in my union apprenticeship, was at one of the only 3 Broadway apprenticeships at the time. I was at what is now the Hames Theater on 42nd Street. It was the American Airlines Theater while I was there. And it was my home. It was accepting, it was wonderful. I came into what I call pale, male, and stale industry with a rainbow tattooed on my chest and at the time turquoise undercut. So it wasn't exactly subtle when I walked into the building. And in that building, it became my family. I deal with misogynistic comments and everyone else around me would go, ooh, because they knew I wasn't going to handle it well. That being said, the industry as a whole is not necessarily like that, surprisingly enough. ATSE Local 1 is the oldest entertainment union in the country. We were founded in 1886 by 13 sailors. And our demographics still really reflect that in the sense of we are 95% male, cis male, 92 or 3% white, and not every venue is as welcoming as my home venue was. And so the main reason I was asked to speak here today is about me getting gender-inclusive language brought into my constitution. It started at the beginning of the pandemic. The entire industry shut down for close to 18 months here in the city. And we suddenly had a lot of time on our hands and a lot of time to watch the news. And so very late to the game, my union went, oh, we should probably do something with this whole social justice thing. So we founded the Social Justice Committee, and I was very quickly, I don't know if it was elected or voluntold by the chair of the committee to represent queer and gender issues. And the very first thing I wanted to talk about was the gendered language in our industry. It's always chairman, it's always flyman, it's always a prop man, things like that. And that language kind of matters. And so I'm like, you know what, let me start in our Constitution. Every individual local has its own Constitution that it establishes itself with. Our second preamble statement was in this document where the masculine is mentioned should therefore represent the feminine. Okay. Thank you for that representation. There were maybe 10 he or she's in the entire document, but that was it. And so at the time, this was obviously in like 2020 or so, it was before I came out as non-binary. It was with the rise of non-binary and trans and the gender spectrum and everything being more known, I was worried that there were members that were going to fall through the cracks. If it was only explicitly a binary reference genders in our Constitution. And so I happened to be in a entertainment labor law class with my union's labor lawyer. So I went to him and talked to him about the Constitution and about using they or them as a gender neutral singular. And he was actually questioning from a legal perspective. Nothing having to do with social beliefs or social justice or anything. He's just like, legally, some lawyers really don't like it. Because it can be confusing. It can be misinterpreted. And I said, that's completely fair. So maybe we have to do he, she, or they, or find other ways to make this happen. And then when I went through our document, we had 17 existing examples of they being used as a singular. And I said, cool beans. All right, that makes this easy. And as people in my union started to find out this is what I was doing, I started to receive a lot of clapback. My own mentor stopped speaking to me because she felt I was erasing women in the union and I was part of the problem. And all of this happened over the course of me completely unrelated discovering I was non-binary. And it wasn't like I was on some search or anything else. I've been obviously queer my whole life, but I've been very out and vocal. And when I came out as non-binary, it was just kind of like a duh moment for me. And I kept it secret, not because I was ashamed, not because I wanted to be in the closet, but mostly because A, it was no one else's business. For me, the coming out as non-binary is for me. I wasn't looking to have my pronouns changed or anything else. But I also knew that given what I was doing with the gender neutral language amendment, it was going to come across as me being self-interested. And so I kept it quiet, only told my very closest friends and didn't say anything. And the way it works with our union to bring things up for an amendment to the Constitution is it gets read to the executive board. They bring it to the lawyers to see if it's cognizable and legal. The union board votes on it to have an opinion. That opinion is shared with the general membership. And then there's a vote. There's 2 months where it's read once for you to think about it, once for you to get comments and whatever. This amendment received 0 support out of 14 executive officers. Even the person who put me in charge of the gender neutral, put me in charge of the social justice portion of the social justice, the person who put me in charge of the gender and sexuality portion of the social justice committee abstained from the vote. So it was a 0 support. To the point where we had business agents Googling, these them people, they don't know what they are, even though proposition. Non-binary people were called its, were called objects. It didn't know what it is. And we had the vice president of our union at the time say, of course gender matters. Who hasn't had to come through a woman's legs to get here? And he said that in front of the entire membership. And that's when I knew I needed to come out, oddly enough, is I had reserved the right as the amendment proposer to be the last person to speak on the issue. And I got up to the mic and first started with that story about the labor lawyer, and explained that this was coming out of legal precedent, clarification of language, and a benefit for the Constitution and for a representation of all of our members. Got that out of the way. And then I followed up with saying, for those of our members who called non-binary people its and things, and that we don't know what we are, I know exactly what I am, and I'm non-binary. And I'm telling you that the only thing I want is to be treated like everyone else in this room. I am not an amp rack. I am not a piece of technology. I am a human being who works just as hard as the rest of you in my union. Why am I treated with less respect just because you don't understand my life? I finished talking, apparently received a standing ovation because I walked to the back of the room and had a panic attack. And I've been told again, because I actually don't remember, I've been told it passed unanimously. Everyone in the room of around 400 people voted for it, and it is the only amendment in my union's history to pass without executive board endorsement. And the thing I'm most proud of when it comes to that is actually, next weekend we have 26 amendments coming up to be done in our Constitution, and half of them are just clarifying more language of he's, she's, and they's that actually I missed, because we had so many versions of the document, and it's a non-issue. We've had a series of these amendments come up where it's just clarifying the language, and people have actually accepted it as being logical, as being the right thing to do. And the fact that over the past 4 years it's become a non-issue is the biggest point of pride for me. And so that's really shaped my experience of being queer in my union. I tried to form a queer committee before that amendment came up, and I was told we aren't ready, it's not gonna happen. The new president and the new administration that came in 2 years after that amendment issue, our pale, male, and stale president wanted to start the Pride Committee. He's like, we need to lead the charge, we need to do this, and we're late to the game. So I'm one of the chairs of that committee right now. I'd be lying if we were the most active committee in the world, mostly because I can't physically work anymore. And everyone else is on a big Broadway show, so we're working on getting more internal organizing and more participation in the Pride Committee. But we march every year in the New York City Pride Parade now, and that never would have happened 10 years ago. So getting to represent both my local and my international in one of the biggest pride parades in the world is one of the biggest points of pride for me in my career, because it so easily couldn't have happened, and enough people pushed in the right ways that it did. So that's my story.
Thank you so much. I have lived in both the East Village and Southern Brooklyn, and I can attest that where I live now, there's a lot of organizing opportunities in many different ways. So one of the privileges I have on this panel is I serve as the vice president of the PSC CUNY, the union that represents 30,000 academic workers here at the City University of New York. And as a principal officer of the union, unlike my peers here who are rank and file members of their unions, I do not have to ask myself permission to talk about my own collective bargaining agreement. So that's both its flaws and its difficulties. That's one of the privileges I have on this panel. So this is an important time. I think it's probably everyone who chose to come to this panel knows that we are both at a time, obviously, of enormous attack in terms of queer and trans communities, but at the same time, we are also in a moment when there is an uptick in union organizing, generational shift and interest in union organizing, although all of those kinds of headlines that you sometimes see in terms of like union interest and like hundreds of thousands of workers that have joined in the past 5 years unions, there should be an asterisk there on those numbers, because as baby boomers leave the workforce, the union density shifts downward. And that is, right, that is one of the struggles, right, that we face in terms of like maintaining union density, even as there is this enormous growth and interest in like organizing and in new organizing. And that new organizing interest is enormously important, and it's enormously important for us to fund with union dollars. So that's also one of the things that, if we have a chance, we might take up in question and answer about like, how do we fund more union organizing? One of those things is like, so for example, also probably everyone in this room knows, right, it is about 34% of public sector workers and about 6% of workers who are unionized in the private sector. But for LGBTQ folks, folks are more, and there was a good study that came out last year on this, folks are more, you're more likely to find LGBTQ folks in service industry jobs than anywhere else. And this is where I feel, as in many rooms in this conference, feel Amber Hollivad's presence talking about what it means to either try or fail to try to organize service workers. One of my attempts when Matt and I talked about being, we were talking about being here, I had made a couple attempts to reach out to some colleagues that I knew at 1199. And I really wanted to have a healthcare worker from 1199 come here who was a home care worker, right? So someone who takes care of people in their home, because I knew there were some specific issues that union had faced around LGBTQ violence and protection. And that person did not, two of the people that I talked to didn't come, not because they weren't permitted by 1199 to come, it was that there aren't enough healthcare workers. And so both of them had to say, there's no way for me to come, right, on a Saturday. Like, I need to work every Saturday, I'm going to be scheduled on a Saturday, that's not an option for me, right? So part of it also is like, the organizing work that we have to do where people are and where they are, right, in the economy. When we think about collective bargaining agreements and anti-discrimination generally, like really broadly, we often, and probably a lot of folks here know, we often can use collective bargaining agreements where they are progressive or aggressive in some places where like anti-discrimination law isn't enough. So like in New York, that has robust anti-discrimination protections at the city, state levels, that is less critical than in many places where collective bargaining agreements can in fact provide protections that other places can't. Now, just as we've heard on this panel, the question is about the willingness or the will, right, to do that. But that is one of the things that collective bargaining agreements can provide. It is also something that we should all do and take organizing in terms of how to extend those collective bargaining agreements. So, and just when we ask people, right, like what are the kinds of like LGBTQ issues, like when you survey folks in your union, which we've done, right, about like what are the kinds of issues that come up for people in workplaces and how does that intersect with folks on queer and trans issues, people tend to name, right, 4 or 5 categories that people are familiar with in terms of benefits in healthcare, worker protections, and different kinds of things about dignity and respect. But a lot of them fall into the categories of safety, right, that discrimination, and kind of bullying and violence. Something I'm interested in as a union officer is doing work that many peers are around the country in trying to take the health and safety committees that exist inside of pretty much every union and expanding them to think about how bullying and anti-discrimination should fall under health and safety organizing. And that's the inroad then legally also to think about health and safety as part of also what is anti-discrimination. And there's a reason for this that comes up specifically in unions. When you are thinking about like anti-discrimination in the workplace, right, we might be thinking about it as like, say, a worker, a barista, and a customer. But as in the examples we've just heard, we are also thinking about it, and this is the most tricky issue for any union, it is member to member, right? So member-to-member violence, member-to-member bullying, member-to-member discrimination is the tough nut to crack here. It's the thing that we could organize a whole conference around the difficulties in labor. There are responsibilities to defend members who do wrong. And so very often in cases of bullying, sexual harassment, other kinds of workplace violence, if in fact a member who does something wrong gets in trouble, that is the point where the union gets involved. And so the union therefore then sometimes doesn't become the place where the person who has been the victim of those forms of violence, the victims of that harassment, seeks solace. And that is a problem. And so some of the work that I'm interested in doing and I've been trying to do within our union is to try to balance that out, to try to find ways to sort of signal that members need to be supported, right, on kind of from all vantage points. To shift gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about union representation, and this is also, right, something that has come up a little bit here. Here we're in a really amazing kind of moment in terms of like being academic workers. Randy Weingarten is the president of the AFT, representing 1.8 million workers, and she is a lesbian. She's an out and proud lesbian, right, and talks about LGBTQ representation in schools, among her workforce, which also includes nurses and a bunch of other professions that are besides teachers. And that is enormously important. Randy has also used that not only authority, but the dollars that the AFT has to pursue measures, including legislation, in like both protecting trans folks and in LGBTQ violence. And I've never been more proud. I sometimes feel very, very frustrated with my parent unions, but I've never been more proud to pay AFT dues than I am right now because of the kind of lawsuits that the AFT is waging, including lawsuits to protect trans and queer kids in schools right now. But that like also needs to extend, right? That's also the kinds of like work that we need to extend to all workers, right? And not just like children in schools. And those, right, are really tough things. Melinda Person here, so here at the New York State United Teachers, Melinda Person is also a out and proud lesbian. And one of the things that union dues, right, just like I was saying about like Randy, one of the ways in which we were talking about like unions can use that power, union use that political power, right, in like broad strokes politics. So one of the things that Melinda Person's done at NYSET, not only does she advocate for teachers all across the state, but she works in the state legislature to shore up laws. For example, when Melinda and her spouse went to have the non-birth parent adopt the children, she went and testified before the state legislature about the fees and extraordinary cost in adoption, right, for the non-birth parent. And wouldn't it be nice to have a legislative fix to that problem, which is something she is still seeking. When a member here in our union at the PSC sought to have IVF, we had to go to the city and fix our health insurance because if you wanted to have an IUI, which means then an attempt at insemination outside of inserting an egg, but you wanted to have if you wanted to have just insemination of semen, you would first, the definition of infertility that would allow you to have the IUI covered by insurance said that you had to testify and sign a piece of paper that you had been trying naturally for 6 to 12 months. And the lesbians were like, well, we could try. I don't think that's what they mean. And I don't think they mean a turkey baster. So, right, the coverage of that IUI, in fact, we took that case through pressure both the city and then it was ultimately the intervention of the Human Rights Commission in New York City and their threat that ultimately ended up having to adjust IUI treatment right here for New York City workers. Those are just like small examples of the ways in which kind of union advocacy, right, needs to continue, right, to adjust healthcare. And that was like a local fix on a problem. It didn't fix like all of the health insurance plans in New York City, right, just the ones, right, for the covered municipal workers. When we think about the ways in which unions have been the engines of mobility for many people. I know as a unionist, I spend a lot of my time talking about how Black and brown communities, and Black and brown women in particular, are uplifted by work that they have done, sometimes for generations in their family, through even specifically the two largest unions in New York City, DC 37 and UFT. Black and brown women make up the majority of the staff that staff schools, and our DC 37 is the largest union in New York City of municipal workers, like people who staff agencies in like low to moderate pay jobs. But it is those jobs, the stability of those jobs, the pension that comes with those jobs, and the benefit of those jobs that has often lifted families up into the middle class. What we notice is that when you go to those rallies that I go to all the time, you don't hear people talking about queer and trans folks, even though queer and trans folks should be in that same logic applies, and this is where I hear Amber again. That same logic applies to exactly that same community argument, and it is persistently one that is not made. And right now, at the moment when hundreds of thousands of people are about to lose their health insurance, like here in New York, people are going to lose the essential plan because of the cost shifts from the federal to the state government so that the ultra wealthy can have tax breaks. Hundreds of thousands of people, right, and millions of people nationally are going to lose their health insurance, right? And queer communities are disproportionately affected by that shift. But we are not talking about, right, but that argument publicly doesn't have that narrative. And again, it links back to where you find queer folks in service jobs, and that those service jobs don't always come with that health insurance, right? So Kai was talking about not being able to access that. So those workers, in fact, I bet if I was to walk around with a clipboard, I would find that a lot of Starbucks workers are on New York's essential plan. I would make a very large bet, right, that that's where you would find them. When we think about some of the work that's coming forward, I'm wearing a sticker for May Day, right? We're hoping to have a very large labor flex all over the country. And I'm really hoping that queer and trans issues will be very visible. It's something our union is working on, so that May Day is a day when that is really visible. That's important for a number of reasons, right? It's important for thinking about the politics locally. It's important in the sort of framework of using union power to fight back, right, against the attacks that are happening specifically to queer and trans communities, but also within labor, right? That visibility within the labor movement needs to also be one of pride and defense of vulnerable neighbors. And that extends also to thinking about the midterms and kind of argument that Kamala Harris lost because she talked too much about particular communities, including queer and trans communities, right? And that there's a side of the argument, right, that is a side that the mayor of New York City or someone like Hassan Piker are very willing to say, no, it's not, in fact, talking about queer and trans issues that are the problem. And it's frustrating to think about moving into that moment right now, but that's, in fact, where we are. And that I hope that there is kind of union leadership, right, nationally on those issues that can, in fact, make LGBTQ issues, right, good politics. I'll say in closing, I'm a political scientist. I am writing a book on bathroom politics. So one of the things that I would love to see, not only in terms of like union practice, is within those health and safety arguments, is that having safe bathrooms, having violence-free bathrooms, having good bathroom access for everybody, not just in the workplace, but everywhere, right, everywhere in public, right, is good for trans and queer people. And it's something that I think unions should lean on, just the same way that has happened, right, for some, but not all here in New York City. I'll stop there. So we have lots of time, right, for questions and discussion among ourselves and with you all. And because we are recording on Zoom, just a reminder that you're encouraged to come to the microphones because people won't hear you on the recording otherwise.
Hi. So the question I have is for Emily, and that is there's been attacks all over the country by far right-wing forces that are attempting to enforce sort of a regime of censorship. And as president-elect, you were talking about the important role of unions in protecting line workers, librarians in, throughout the country wherever there were unions. So can you talk a little bit about how that's going this year and what you're...
How protecting, can you say a little bit more about your question? What kind of form of protection is going this year?
Yeah, like how, are you seeing that the unions are actually protecting the librarians? And are most of the cases where people are getting fired, there's no union protection?
So Emily Drabinski, unfortunately, is not here, right? And I would love, no, it's okay. She's not here. But this issue about librarians, right? So the librarians, a lot of the librarians, right, that Emily is working with and that are featured in there's this new documentary that is about, right, right, this struggle. The majority of those workers are unionized, who are librarians, right, tend to be public sector workers and tend to be unionized workers. But that doesn't stop then like the penalties or threats against people, and it doesn't stop, right, people from jobs from being threatened, and it doesn't stop people from being able to do the substance of their work, right? And so that is something, right, that's something that continues, right? There were New York State librarians, both public and private places, that were threatened in terms of like, right, it means that their job is interfered with, right? And so, and that has not stopped. Right, all over the country, that has not stopped. Right, so that is in fact the thing that we have to, continue to work on and organize around. And it's really important that we do. Yeah.
So, anyone on the panel and everyone in this room could share stories about unions screwing with queer and trans workers, and it's not rare. And so when you say we need to get our unions involved and being part of saying that protecting queer and trans workers is not something unions should shy away from, the question is, how do we get that to happen? Like, every single enormous bureaucratic top-down union has avoided this issue like it means certain death for years. So how do we get our unions? And, we have adjunct faculty being laid off left and right, most of whom are queer. Starbucks lays off queer and trans people daily. So how can we get our union bureaucracies to realize that protecting queer and trans workers is, in fact, their job, instead of something that they need to be like, we don't want to disturb the majority here by taking a really risky position that these workers are human. And it's a real question that I work for a union, right? So I face that question every day. How do you make a union take this issue seriously? Because unions are the only people who will, but unions won't. So I want you to solve my problem.
For me, I've fought with that myself because we've had so many old school stagehands use highly outdated terminology in general and at different members. And at least I found, given I'm in a incredibly blue collar construction sort of field, but highlighting the fact that it's about respect. It's not about anything having to do with my personal life. I am a worker like you are a worker. Why are you protected from job loss and I am not? Why are people like me disproportionately getting punitive action, stuff like that, or not getting the right representation from Weingartner's rights or whatever? So for me, pushing the respect element is what gets old white guys' attention in my bureaucratic union. And so, yeah, that's my biggest push, is just really show the fact that if you're not protecting all of us, you're protecting none of us.
I guess I'll say something as well, even though I'm in a very different context. I mean, my union, I can't remember when the last time we actually surveyed it is, but I think we're like 75% queer, which is like a crazy stat. So it's a very different situation, and it's kind of the reverse, where for us to do anything, we have to prioritize queer workers because that is our membership. But also, we don't have a contract. We don't have locals. We are only international, and it's like a very different context. But from my personal organizing experience, it's like the worker-to-worker relationships that change people, in my experience. And not to poo-poo staff, but yeah, it's to me, like, it's workers who change each other, and that's at both of the stores I've worked at. It's workers who change each other's minds, and I think, it is that understanding that we're all workers and our power comes from our labor, even mine, even though I'm gay, like I still have labor power just like you. And so understanding that context, I think, can only happen through workers caring about each other. And that's kind of a hard ask, and it's not really a solution, because how do you get people to interact with each other enough in a meaningful way for that change to happen? But I guess that's the direction you have to move towards, in my opinion.
I mean, if teachers are being fired, then I would want to understand their work situation in terms of their relationship to their work protections, right? Their tenure or not tenure, and then, go from there. But that, but in a world where in higher education, where 60% of people are gig workers with very little protection, right, that's an issue, and that's an issue for everybody, right? And so that is one of the kinds of things, right, that we face. And it's among the different reasons why it's important for everybody to be involved in, more workplace protections and more job security, and for those things to, and for job security protection to lead, not just extend only to academic workers, but for people, right, far beyond that, right, in other sectors. I guess I also want to see, I know that in my time as a unionist in the past 20 years, I have had 5 different friends from different places in the U.S. call up whom I have said, here, I have found an attorney who is a labor attorney that I think you should go and say your union failed to represent you. And that the failure to represent is the worst thing a union can do, and it actually is the place where the union is on the hook. And that unions will often settle a failure to defend rather than go to court on that, right? Even if it might be murky around your ability to say, well, if these 30 people were fired or non-reappointed this year, why is my case different than the rest? But I think that people do need to build up muscle around failure to defend or failure to represent in union situations. And the reason, and the way that we know that, and the way that we know that tool can sometimes work, is because of things that Black folks have used inside of unions to try to force unions to be less racist. And there is a 175-year history, right, around that. That we can look at, and then we can look at those tools, right? And that is unfortunately, right, that kind of unfortunately, right, some people do have to be compelled, in addition to the kind of organizing work that we have to continue to do. I know that when in my union, we were forming federal fight-back committees around Trump's second election, I took the opportunity to say, hey, it's time we have a sexuality and gender justice working group, right? And we're gonna make this part, and we're gonna make that, and we're gonna make it those issues, right, part of the visible work that we do, because it was a moment to be able to do that, to create more visibility of queer workers, of trans workers, right? Unfortunately, in moments of attack, right, that institutionalizes that. But that was an opportunity, right? That was an opportunity to do that, and now like we're working on pushing more resources, right, to that group, right, for exactly all those reasons, right, because it has to become more visible, and you have to then point out the ways in which people, right, are more vulnerable. But the other thing is, like when I was talking about something about the midterms, right, our union power is so low politically that all we can do in the Democratic Party is say, like, if you ask somebody running for office, you say, are you pro-union and will you vote for pro-union things? The only thing they know how to say is, I'm for the PRO Act, which relates, right, to union organizing and making it easier for unions to organize. You never get to have the conversations that are about penalties. You never get to have the conversations that are about the penalties of employers when they do wrong, and frankly, the penalties to unions when they do wrong. And it is penalties, right, that would change the terrain. But we don't get there, but we need to.
For also adding to that, that really reminds me, so another thing that we can do is really concentrate on mutual gains. So what will be incredibly helpful for our queer community members in our union, but also can't really be argued from non-queer members or from people who might not be wanting to invest solely in queer members. So for example, when you brought up precarity, the light bulb went off in my brain going, none of us want to be precarious. None of us want to be in that kind of gig work, well, very few of us want to be in that gig work scenario that doesn't have a stability or a sense of control at the very least. Within entertainment, the absolute vast majority of us are gig workers. Even on Broadway, the big Broadway head that makes over $200K a year does not have just cause protection in our contracts right now. That is because we are an informal social network-based hiring structure. I get hired and fired by text. I can't remember the last time I've used a resume for something that wasn't academic. So when I've had sexual harassment issues, when I've had homophobic or trans issues with myself, I have to play the game of, do I risk my career by reporting it? Or do I just suck it up, buttercup? And that's where you can really start to highlight the fact that, at least again in our precariousness, highlight the fact that you don't want to be precarious. And that's such an easy thing to do for union members, specifically in adjunct unions and stuff like that. And if you start strengthening protections for everyone, you can start to then kind of weave in those protections that will begin to equalize the playing field. And so it's not just like, have you ever seen the meme that has like the people up by the fence? And it's like, here's equality and here's equity and stuff like that. If you start from advertising it as a base of equality and bettering conditions for everyone, it's, at least I have found, it's easier to build then pieces of equity into that to start bringing things up to the same level.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Matt, and I have a question about the ways that in our union, so I'm in the PSC CUNY along with Jen, and my question is about the ways homophobia and transphobia are justified as cost-saving measures, although they're not called homophobia and transphobia. But especially, you mentioned healthcare, and a lot of us join unions, or the biggest benefit we feel from the union is our healthcare, and that has been true for me in the PSC CUNY. There are lots of other benefits, but that's the biggest one. I'm HIV positive, though, and so the end of this story is there's been really good change in our union. But the beginning of this story is that I was told that the way our prescription benefit works is that after a certain amount of money, $10,000, the copay moves from 20% to 50%, and after $15,000, the copay moves to 80%. But HIV drugs are $35,000 a year. And I was told by our union that if they had to cover the expense of those drugs, then nobody would get health care. And of course, so when this discussion was happening, they started having some open meetings, and everybody who showed up to those open meetings was HIV positive. That was who was coming. That was who. It's not that we are the only expensive people, right? But we were feeling it enough to show up. We didn't know each other. We hadn't planned to go together. This wasn't an action on our part. And you think of all the other instances of the ways that transphobia, homophobia, and misogyny are turned into the logics of cost savings. And I think within our union now, there's a sort of high cost option, or they encourage us to be part of a catastrophic plan that is outside the union, but you can only sign up for that once every 7 years. And so just the idea of healthcare and and LGBTQ and the ways that homophobia masquerades as sort of common sense cost saving, that if we didn't do it, it would hurt all of us. And so some people have to take the pain so that everybody can benefit from pretty good healthcare coverage.
That's right. That issue, right? I mean, there's lots of different kinds of issues where, unfortunately, this is true, right? But Matt is absolutely correct, right? That, for example, that gender-affirming care, right, transition care, infertility treatment, or making a baby through lots of different kinds of means, right, and HIV healthcare are three of, if you were to name a bunch of expensive areas, right, are three of the kind of like top 20, right, things that you find on those kinds of like expensive and undercovered, right, treatment areas. And it is one, and it is real neglect, right? And here in New York City, we face, we don't, as our union, we don't bargain for our healthcare directly. We bargain as a group of 1.3 million workers because we all get municipal city healthcare. So we like to take our good union values, right, where we believe that we are a union, right, that supports like LGBT rights to medical care, but we have to go and argue with other unions to do so and make those changes. And we haven't been able to make those changes because of that, right? And for all the kinds of things, right, that Kayleigh was talking about, right, it's that kind of environment where it's like, well, that would be nice to do that, right, but we can't afford that. And then you see like unions, right, struggling with some of those kinds of things. And the fact that then needs to be, right, and obviously a lot of it is we need a much better, right, overhaul of our entire healthcare system so that we are not talking about, for, drug coverage, right? Did anybody notice that on your Con Ed bill, does everybody know about the surcharge for GLP-1 drugs? So in New York City, you are paying a $9 service charge right now. I'm on a GLP-1 drug and I'm paying out of pocket for them. And this is going to become the number one area of the most expensive thing that is not covered potentially. Con Ed now charges a $9 surcharge, and when you dig into it, it's the healthcare costs to cover GLP-1 drugs, like Ozempic, and that money is basically going back to pharma, right? So you're paying big pharma through your Con Ed bill. I want everyone to walk out of here enjoying that fun fact. But we obviously need an overhaul, right, of this system, and we need that system to robustly, right, honor, right, queer and trans healthcare, absolutely. Matt, thank you very much for raising that issue.
I just also wanted to add something really quick. Obviously, we don't have a contract, so it's different. But Starbucks loves to tell us that they can't spend money on things that would benefit queer people or workers in general. And also because our union is so queer, honestly, anything that is anti-union is anti-queer in my context, which I think is also true in more than just our context. But it is also interesting, recently Starbucks had a stakeholders meeting, or they're going to have a stakeholders meeting, and they put out a survey about what to discuss at the stakeholders meeting. And one of the questions was about trans healthcare and either removing it from the healthcare plan or adding detransitioning into, if you're going to have healthcare for trans workers, you also have to have it in case, I think the wording was like they were influenced by someone to transition. So it's also crazy when they decide to add money, like you'd have to spend more money on that in theory, although I don't even know if anyone would take them up on that offer. But it is also interesting what they choose to care about and when they do. And thankfully, it was like completely shot down. Nobody cared about that amongst the stakeholders. Yeah, I think big companies always will choose profit. And so when we're building our first contract, as we continue to do, hopefully we'll get one, that is something that we think about a lot. And obviously it goes both ways. But yeah, healthcare is a very interesting topic.
I feel like this is actually one of the few places where I feel like I have something positive to say. So my union has, I want to say surprisingly, actually been incredibly proactive when it comes to covering trans and gender conforming and in vitro fertilization and a lot of those sorts of things. So for years, for example, even though we only have at the time we had like a 4% women or female identifying population in our union, we would get mammogram trucks outside of our union meetings to help. And I think we've included trans care for I think over 10 or 15 years now. And actually, again, some of the trans exclusionary feminists in my union won't necessarily agree with this, but actually the first woman in our union was trans. They originally got in before they transitioned, but then they transitioned after the fact. And they were the first woman in the 1970s, 1976, I think. And so to quick explain the way our welfare system works, and I apologize if other unions are like this, I'm just going to explain because I don't think they are, so our welfare fund is obviously legally a completely separate entity from our union, but our, wow, the word is completely, our board of trustees, there we go, is made up of 3 union officers and 3 management officers. So it's specifically 2 of them are from Big Broadway, the Producers League, and 1 of them is from the Metropolitan Opera, I believe. And so collectively, the 6 of them make the decisions about how we spend our money in our healthcare. And that has actually been a humongous help because it's the employers and the management, it's them not wanting to get sued because there's a higher proportion of those services being needed on the more gender diverse side. And so they've actually been helping pull our union by our teeth into the more inclusive covering measures. And yeah.
I would just say to close out that issue, fighting for single-payer health care, right, is a queer and trans issue, right? And here in New York State, we have the opportunity to fight for the New York Health Act, right, which is something we should do, and we should make sure that we make queer and trans issues, including the ones Matt's identified, as, like, central to that, because none of us should be paying out of pocket, like, at that rate. Like, no one should. A few more minutes if folks have questions, comments.
Hi, so this question is mainly for Kayleigh, I suppose. I mean, first, my name is Skylar. I actually work seasonally as a stagehand in ATSE 15, Seattle. And I mean, I don't know how exactly like the sort of breakdown of various like, calls and gigs essentially is like in, ATSE 1, but there's kind of this kind of disparity in ATSE 15. Like a lot of, what we're working is, concerts, and concerts happen mainly during the summer. So there's there's, we have a hiring hall, and, relatively like a small portion of like those on the seniority list are actually full union members. The most are permanent workers who just like work seasonally, and it's kind of hard to, get, hours to, increase your seniority number if you, don't already have list preference, essentially. And the reason why I mentioned this in this context of queerness is because, like, I'm a college student right now, but and that's why I'm, partly working seasonally. But a lot of the full members of the union are a lot of the older, and I think ATSE 15 is maybe more diverse than some other locals. But generally speaking, like, our tend to be, more older male. Workers are those who have, full voting rights as members, and a lot of, the younger, more diverse, more queer and more trans are those who are permanent workers. And I guess in the question of, maintaining unions and also trying to expand unions, how do you see like possibilities for building out a broader, more diverse union at the same time when there is this kind of like impetus for the full members or like higher seniority people to kind of maintain their position within the union?
That is kind of like $1 million question. How do we get leadership to change when we don't necessarily have a seat at the table that they're controlling? So did you say it's hiring hall based and seniority list based? Okay. I have to say I'm not as familiar with that structure just because my union's like, seniority? What's that? This is my son. He's home from college. $70 an hour job, please. Not that I'm bitter. My biggest thing that I would recommend is getting people active. So whenever there are union events, see if permanent members can go and attend. Get your face seen, because again, it sounds like even with the hiring hall structure, it's, as you said, it's seasonal, it's precarious, it's still gig work. Get your face and name seen and associated with being the best worker you can be. And kind of, if other people, if the union members or whatever have those negative stereotypes, break those down. Show them that you can do the job just as well as anyone else can. And it doesn't matter any of your other demographics or identifying features. You are who you are, and who you are is a good worker, right? So pushing for that would be a big thing. And then unfortunately, it's a waiting game. Because eventually, as you were talking about earlier, it's like the older generations are slowly leaving, and there's going to be space to fill that gap. There's going to be space to fill the void. And so I'm not saying bide your time, but like do what you can, keep working as hard as you can now, and know that change is coming and that you're going to be part of that change as you go.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess also this is just kind of a question for everyone. This is just a different topic, but like one of the things that I think all of you kind of like briefly mentioned is the question of, broader like solidarity, political advocacy within unions. And, I think something that a lot of, Marxists have talked for the longest time is talking about the Taft-Hartley Act. And how, I mean, this is, ancient history at this point, going all the way back to the 1950s, but that there are limitations on, general strikes and solidarity strikes. And also even there seems to be, like, talking to some, my coworkers, like there's, feels to be kind of like a weakness in unions advocating for sort of like more general political causes, even when it like doesn't necessarily feel like something is like directly like applicable to the membership. And so what do you think the potential in unions being not just sort of advocating for labor rights, but advocating for any number of things, like putting out statements or being really active and political in these, broader issues that we, see today.
So New York State has the worst strike penalty law in the country, right? It's called the Taylor Law. And one of the things that we're interested in doing potentially is like looking at, and this is something that we could like take to, for example, the mayor first, and what a category of things that we call Mamdani opportunities now, to potentially look at like what would it take to change and alter at the state level the strike penalties. Some states, in many, many states, it's illegal to strike, but the penalties are a kind of slap on the wrist, and you have that. But the issue you're getting at, it is sometimes a kind of myopic selfishness where unions sort of say, well, my duty is to my members, and they do that as an excuse in many ways to not kind of mobilize and organize and not do kind of hardcore solidarity work, right, in any way. That's why I'm wearing this May Day sticker, right? So that it is in fact getting, right, and really changing, right, union culture, right, to do that, and that for unions that are active, it is getting people to not just say like passing a resolution within their body and publicizing it is like the acts of solidarity, but really having like flying squads of people that go out and regularly go to picket lines, go to other people's events, and really having kind of like robust solidarity as not like just occasional, like because there was a nurses strike just here in New York City where a bunch of people did come out, but they came out because of the excitement and impact of that strike. Right, and that was, but that to do that more consistently, right, when it is less glamorous, is enormously important. And I also think it's the kind of thing that has the possibility. Like we think that the nurses' strike entered kind of more general consciousness of workers generally across the city, and it's that kind of thing, right? That successful strike, where that is the kind of thing that is part of what is important right now, like seeing people strike and win, that can help us like try to create greater worker density and excitement for unions in just the same way that Starbucks was was once not unionized, right? I was trying to think this morning when I was getting coffee, like, I have deleted my Starbucks app, right? As Starbucks Workers United asked me to do, right? Do I go to Starbucks, right? Or do I go to Le Pain Quotidien where I know they're not unionized? These are not great choices.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because my union is so social justice focused, and I think we have a little bit more freedom because we don't have a contract and we don't have locals, and our membership is very, very social justice oriented, and so we already have that culture that we were just discussing, and the membership makes it so that there's no choice but to show solidarity, and so I think that's one route, which is hard in stagehand line of work. I think it's probably much harder to create that culture with the type of membership that you might have. But I think that's like one route. And I think, yeah, being on strike, like solidarity is such a big, it's a discipline, it's a practice. And so like I've been to so many different union events and so many different people know my face now, and that meant that we had steelworkers showing up at our picket line with a bunch of like random gay baristas at 6 a.m, and there's like a bunch of really buff steelworkers being like, "You can't go in there, you can't be a scab." Like it's change can happen in more ways than one, and so it's also like part of creating that culture is also that cross-union solidarity and that cross-issue solidarity. If you start there, then it builds.
Sorry. This is less IATSE specific focused, but I don't think enough people talk about and know about bargaining for the common good. I feel like that is such I don't want to say easy, but it's a no-brainer way to begin to get this activism and everything else and get it beyond wages, hours, and working conditions, right? So to have an IATSE example, in 2023, we actually had a huge slew of attacks on stagehands leaving shows at the end of the evening from individuals from the housing insecure community. Rare, incredibly uncommon. Most of them had different untreated mental illnesses, unfortunately. And so that was such an opportunity for my union to begin to push for better care, push for better solidarity with individuals who were struggling in those ways, because it became a safety condition for us. And so reframing issues of within your union or within your jurisdiction and reframing them as in what in the larger society can begin to help that can help draw people more into political activism and more into social justice focuses by realizing you're not limited by wages, hours, and working conditions.
Yep. All right, we have to wrap it there. I want to thank everybody for coming to this panel, and I hope everyone will go out to May Day activities wherever you live. On May Day here, we start in Washington Square Park at 4 o'clock.